Me and the Lord, we got an understanding.
We're on a mission from God.
Hello and welcome back to the Black Lodge Games podcast. I'm your host, Matt, and with me, as always, is Nick. Today, we're going to be talking about some more gaming-related topics. We're stepping away from reacting to people's videos, watching cringe and getting angry at the state of WotC, and we're just going to get right back into the important things on this channel, the good stuff, which is immersive role-playing games. And today, we've been watching a lot of conversations on YouTube recently about kind of new school D&D versus OSR style play and the use of like random encounter tables and the difference between this kind of new narrative style that's being really kind of primarily propagated by things like Critical Role and online D&D shows, other ones, like Transplanar RPG, don't want to leave them out, versus the kind of more original vision of Gygax and all the original TSR guys. That was much more of an open sandbox, a kind of procedurally generated world that the GM is there to be kind of a referee and help simulate a world in which the characters play in, and which is the right style. The answer may shock you that we think that maybe the answer lies somewhere in between those two things. But for the kind of main topic of this podcast today, we are talking about Rails versus Sandbox.
Yes. And I think, like you mentioned, this is one of those perennial topics that comes around again and again from time to time, because it's one of those fundamental questions that people have, players and GMs alike, although perhaps especially GMs, as to how am I supposed to run XYZ game? Take your pick. But I think that the dialogue that I've seen over the years happen regarding this topic, you alluded to the answer being somewhere in the middle. I think that the Rails versus Freeform or the Rails versus Sandbox, dichotomy is something of a false one, because the extreme of either end, certainly from my perspective, it's not ideal, to say the least.
Yeah.
The idea of a completely, what would you say, pre-scripted adventure where you are navigating through a GM's novel or screenplay, or you're reenacting beat for beat a movie, a television program, a book, an adventure module, what have you. It seems just as terrible of an experience to me as something that is wholly procedural without any thought or depth or effort with regard to context or genre or
preparation on the part of the GM.
Or preparation, yeah. So it's a bit of a mind trap to say that, you're either in the freeform camp or the narrative camp or whatever word you want to use.
Yeah.
And, this has been something that's come back on our radar. It's something we've been talking about a lot recently because of some things we've watched, read, heard about. And, to your point, I think, our approach is primarily one that involves motivation from both the player characters and, perhaps more on the GM side, the motivations of the world, the factions in the world, the NPCs who are in that world as the primary driver of play, of the events that happen, of the drama, or the interesting experiences that take place there. You know,
Yeah.
I don't know. Would you say that that's a fair categorization of
Yeah, I think so. And I think that
our dialogue?
there is, I want to say that and I think you'll probably agree with this, that the idea of a totally pre-scripted campaign where the GM is putting in tons and tons and tons of prep work, thinking through, okay, we're going to start in this scene and then they're going to meet this character and then they're going to go along with this character. So the next scene is going to be this, but then the antagonist comes in at, this like string of predetermined story points that the GM is trying to get across. That is a game that is set up for complete failure.
Right.
It's
Any one of those points could hit a snag, or the players do something else, or any number of 1,000 different things could happen.
Right. And it's
and then what?
That's not an experience that I think brings any fun. It's not one that I think brings any immersion, something that is completely driven by the GM. I certainly wouldn't want to play in that game because I do like to make choices, and have consequences for actions.
And it delegitimizes it. It de-incentivizes players from giving their characters depth and motivation, because that motivation, that depth, the connection you have to XYZ, that's going to derail from the narrative that the GM has in mind.
Right. It's going to derail from the narrative that the GM has in mind. And if you're sticking on the rails, if you're going along with it, it's going to derail any sort of creativity or kind of spontaneity or the things that make the game interesting. Like we've said before that like these games, they allow you to tell stories and create stories in a unique way that doesn't exist in any other medium. You don't get the same thing out of consuming a movie, watching a movie, reading a book, playing a video game. All of those things are great. I love doing all of them, but they don't get the same thing that you get out of these games. I heard something, it was probably RPG Pundit who said this in a video, because I'm getting served up lots of his videos by YouTube because I usually watch them from start to finish. But he was describing, there's this thing known as the Matt Mercer Effect. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So it's like new D&D players watch Critical Role. They go, oh my God, this is so much fun.
Pestilence.
This story's amazing. And I'm going to play D&D with my friends and it's going to be exactly the same. And then they sit down and they find out that's not what a D&D game is actually like. And they're disappointed.
Surprise.
And then the GM says, oh, well, this is the Matt Mercer effect. They just don't like me because I'm not as good of a GM as Matt Mercer is. And Pundit said basically that, what they're doing on something like Critical Role is in the same sense that like pornography, the people in pornography, they are having sex, but that is nothing like what an actual sexual experience is like. It's
right.
So in that sense, they are playing D&D on that show, but it's not what a game, is like. So the people have these kind of warped expectations. Oh, and I do want to say, RPGisDUM, I saw a video with him recently where he said something to the effect of, it was like, imagine making up a term like the Matt Mercer effect just to explain why people don't want to hang out with you, which is, I think, true.
I know, right?
Yeah.
Great channel.
Yeah.
And even better Twitter profile.
Yeah. Great Twitter content. Great content on the YouTube channel and on Legion of Myth. I think he's running a Rifts game right now. Very cool stuff. The point here, though, is that if you're getting into these games expecting to have this kind of this really interesting story that would be interesting for other people to watch at all times, you're probably going to be disappointed because it is different than that. The experience fundamentally in a role-playing game, if you're playing them properly, is that a story is going to emerge out of what happens. And I think this is where like the OSR guys, why they like what we've been kind of reading about and watching a lot of content on how these kind of older systems were run, how Gygax was running D&D back in the day, is that they go very much in the direction of, telling a story in a D&D game is much more akin to saying, hey, let's all go fishing, with your friends. You go fishing, you do the thing, and you come back and you have stories that come out of that. Because the story evolves from the actions that you take. And the way that I enjoy running games is closer to that end of the spectrum than it is to this like highly scripted out, pre-planned idea of what the story is going to be, what the narrative is going to be. But I don't simply start from the position of it being a complete sandbox where, you spawn in the tavern.
Right.
And
you did not exist prior to this moment.
What do you do? Where do you go?
Yeah. Yeah, that's, again, just as bad. Possibly even more so. In fact,
I'm not sure I agree with that, because I could still, I think, have a lot of fun doing that and come up with some cool stuff, as long as I had the freedom to actually make choices and face consequences.
If you had good players.
Yes, if you have good players.
They'll key off something.
Right, which again, remember, rule -1, find good players first, vet your players.
Find good players. Yes, exactly. But no, exactly. I think I'm very much in line with, we run games very, very similarly. And are coming at it from a very similar place and preference. You need some kind of circumstance, some kind of either inciting situation or inciting incident. Now, that inciting incident may be, okay, you all know each other and you already are associated somehow.
Yeah.
Or it could be a more overt, heavy-handed situation that happens. But once that is there, an opportunity, a reason for the player characters to be at least aware of the other individuals who are driving the game. Then you can take it in any number of different directions. But the primary motivating factor, the primary drive, is going to be, what are the players, like you said, they did not spawn in with no prehistory,
right?
No motivations, no connections. You want to have characters in your game who, you don't need a multi-page backstory.
Yeah.
You want enough for you to be a believable human being, or whatever.
Provide some sort of authenticity. That like you like, I already know kind of who this person is, and given that I am in the tavern with these people, should something happen, should someone talk to me, spill a drink on me, I kind of have a sense of how I would act in that situation. You want that.
Yeah. And the reason for that, it isn't just to add depth to your character as the player. The reason for that is, okay, I'm a D&D character. I have connections with my family. I have an ambition. I'm a wizard who's attempting to learn greater knowledge. I'm a cleric who's trying to understand, progress, or be more deeply involved in my particular faith. Or I'm a fighter. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to learn these ways of either honing my martial craft, or I'm looking to join the Count's army, or there's a lot of honor bound up in this mercenary. Whatever the case may be, you have connections, motivations, ambitions, and opinions that the GM and the game, the world begins to spin as soon as session one starts. Mm-hmm. And those ambitions, those connections are going to naturally and organically create a lot of the drama, a lot of the story that the game is going to be involved about. And I know both of us have a lot of experience and a lot of opinions. One of the best games and settings that you can give examples, and the game really encourages it, is Vampire.
Yeah.
Masquerade or Requiem, take your pick, mm-hmm. right? Because that world, it puts you in a very particular circumstance. You're on the bottom of the social totem pole. You have no power, you have no respect, you have no influence, usually. And naturally having to deal with your beast, your need for blood every night, the politics of clan, the politics of, if you're playing World of Darkness, the politics of the Camarilla or the Sabbat or the Anarchs, what have you, whatever sect you're a part of, the mortal politics. You're looking to gain influence. You are a lowly...
And to survive.
A low member of the underworld, right? To simply survive, let alone thrive, right?
Right, and this is one of the things where I've got two points here. Is that I watched a video by the Basic Expert on this topic earlier,
right?
And because he was talking about how he builds a game and how he builds a world and how he doesn't spend a whole lot of time prepping. And you have this issue, this separate issue we can talk about later, about kind of GM burnout and whatnot, due to the excessive amount of prep that people have to make to maintain these narrative structured games and whatever. Yeah. But his point was that when he built a game, like the things that he basically needed to come up with was, who are the primary factions? Who are the kind of most powerful characters? Like, who's the most powerful sorcerer? Who's the most powerful noble in the area? Come up with those factions. Come up with a map that has some places on the map that have story hooks, so the characters can go in. When they get there, they can, whichever direction they choose to go in, there will be a story hook for them to bite and follow. And out of that, the game evolves. And during the game, he's using random tables to generate encounters, generate NPCs on the fly, come up with names, all of these things. And it allows it to be a much more kind of procedurally generated, improvised experience. And the story grows out of that. Whereas with something like Vampire, one of the things that we said in our Foundations for a Great Game episode, like the best way that you can set yourself up for success in running these games is to pick a strong setting. And the reason we said that, it's not just because it gives you inspiration because it's cool, but like what you're saying with Vampire is that this has the game has a structure where it just has conflict and motivation and goals for your characters built in right there. Like it is part of the game. You can't escape it. Like if you are starting out as a low-level neonate character, you're the new vampire on the block, like you're right. You have no social connections, you have no political power, you're much weaker than everybody, and you have something to do every single night. You have to go out and feed. You have this unslakable thirst, this thing that you have to satisfy every night. And so just by going out into this world, you are going to run into even if you haven't put as a GM a ton of thought into what's going to happen in the game, the characters are going to get into trouble because you have to feed. So you're going to go out. That's going to go wrong at some point. Doing that's a scene, that you have to deal with. This is something will come out of this. Whether or not you're doing that, you may not know that there's territorial boundaries, and feeding in someone else's territory will get you in a lot of trouble. That's going to create conflict. And as these games evolve, they very much kind of become like this very dark, supernatural mafia story, because that is kind of the structure of the game. So choosing your game system, there's kind of a similar thing going on here between this, like the notion of the sandbox and what I would say is starting with a more structured game, a game that kind of has at its basis these built-in driving conflicts. We're not necessarily doing something that different than this kind of older style, but I think that there's a lot more. Vampire in particular, the World of Darkness games, they really are driven more towards this storytelling style. I mean, they don't even call it a GM or a DM. It's an ST. It's the storyteller. You are the storyteller. But that doesn't mean that everything is pre-plotted out. It's just that it is focused on a certain style of story. That is what the game is going to produce naturally. And if you
the game maps very well to a particular genre and a particular type of story.
Right. And one of the things that I love about Vampire is that generally, like if you get like one of the old city books, those are all great. I mean, they're not all great. Many of them are very good though. And they come pre-packed with NPCs. They come with factions that, are at each other's throats. And there's just all sorts of stuff you can bump into. And generally, what I like to do is pick a couple of those NPCs that I find interesting and put them in the path of the character, and and kind of see what happens. And I probably also have a plan for where I think things are going to go, but that's also because I'm trying to come up with ideas that I think the players are going to be interested in.
Right, you're keying off of the other players' backstories.
Yeah.
What their tendencies are, either both as perhaps a player, but also, okay, I know enough about this character, hopefully, to, at the very least, a sense of what is of interest, what is the ambition. I mean, certainly if we're talking about New World of Darkness, it explicitly has that. You have an ambition, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I can't remember what it is.
With the new 5e VTM, but you have you
have touchstones and you have motivations. I think I can't remember. Touchstones are like these things from your mortal life that are still kind of grounding you to your humanity, which also gives you plenty of fertile ground for stories and things to go off with. Yeah,
right, because it is the world of darkness. Things are going to be happening to that person, that place, that you have a connection by your character's own admission. This matters to them.
Yeah.
Very deeply. And so you do end up, like you said, you end up with an organic, sort of dark criminal mafia, organized crime kind of feel, with a personal horror flair to it.
Yeah.
And your point about bringing in NPCs or factions or what have you from these city books, or any of the other source books for that matter.
And obviously coming up with your own as well. That's something I love
coming
doing.
Up with your own, using them as inspiration, or even just reskinning.
Yeah.
This thing exists in Chicago. Well, I'm going to give it a new name, and I'm going to tailor it to Philadelphia, let's say, or St. Louis, or something. Wherever you want to set this. I'm a big fan of that. I'm not. I don't have any real problem as such with source books, or for that matter, even modules to a certain degree. I tend not to use them, but I love a good premise.
Yes.
I love a great premise. And as a GM, in whatever game I'm running, whether it's a D&D-esque game or Vampire or Cyberpunk or something else, just like the players, are hopefully investing themselves and thinking about their character from a perspective of what is it I want to do? What is it that I not only want to do, that I need to do because of the circumstances that I find myself in? Cyberpunk is a great example for this, because you are also at the bottom of the barrel, whether you're a corpo, working for Arasaka, or you're a nomad, or you're a media, whatever the case may be. It's a cyberpunk dystopia. The world, by its nature, is sort of entropic. It's eating away at your resources. It's eating away at your will. It's eating away at your time. It's always taking from you. The water is always rising. So, whether you are a corpo who's gunning for that corner office, or trying to off your boss to get his job, whatever the case may be, if you're a nomad who's really concerned about your family or your clan, you need resources. You have things that you want to do, you need to do, and you don't have the tools at hand. So what do? You have to go on these, have to get involved. You have to either find a fixer and do something, or you need to make moves against a booster gang territory to get whatever. You need to break into this Ripper Doc's office and be maybe at gunpoint, force him to give you these augmentations that you need, this cyberware, any number of things, but you have to keep doing that.
Yeah, and that's the nature of
the
game.
Rash need to do those things is going to create the drama.
Right. And so I think that one of the problems that people, this is a thought I've just had now, is that a lot of new players, if you're coming into a game like D&D, D&D does have some compelling settings, and people make their own compelling homebrew settings, but the default world of Dungeons and Dragons, that is just the player's handbook, is just this general concept of fantasy. There's not really a structure there off the bat that forces you into action into these things. And so I think a lot of these kind of newbie GMs, they probably do see things like Critical Role or other online play, and they think, okay, I have to come up with the story. So I need to put in all this prep work, and I need to think through what's going to happen and where this is going to go, because I don't have a starting point. Like, it is a sandbox. And there are people who are very comfortable with that. I think people who started playing D&D a long time ago and really used, like, the mechanics. Like, if you were... and I'm so pissed I don't have this book anymore, but there was a first edition Dungeon Master's Guide in my ancestral home at some point. It's gone. But there are a lot of system mechanics that say, okay, here's your sandbox. Here's how you make something happen. And I think that that's actually a really useful tool. I haven't used random encounters in my games before, because when I was coming up, it very much reminded me of just being in the overworld in like Final Fantasy VI, 3 if you're a boomer, walking around the overworld and running into monsters on the way to the next town. And it was really annoying and grindy and didn't add anything. But again, this is, I think, you can totally run it that way and use random tables that way if you're a bad GM. If this is like just grinding for XP. But I think the people who like using that style of tool get a lot out of it, because that for them is this is the inspiration for this is what's going to drive the action in the story. And as the GM, I'm going to find a way to make that make sense within the world right now as we're playing. For me, I like the driver of the action to be more foundational, of just, this is the world that I'm in. And the world itself is already inbuilt, providing this conflict. And so there is, I think, a pretty big difference. There's a pretty big difference from the starting point there. So if you're, if you are playing a game that doesn't have a well-defined setting, you're going to be in the position of either needing to do a lot of work to come up with a bunch of shit yourself, which can be a lot of work for some people. I think you and I are both very good at improvising, so this is not something that's really a much of a problem for us.
Yeah. And I like it.
I do
like
too.
It's a big part of the draw.
Exactly. It's super fun. Like, coming up with stuff on the fly is so much fun. And I've just never used, dice and tables and, those kinds of things to do that. I've just relied on, my own imagination and myself. But generally, I think what I am relying on is my knowledge of the setting. Because when I find a setting that I like, I tend to consume it entirely. I enjoy absorbing the material. I enjoy learning about the setting and coming up with ideas. And because there's a setting book that I'm reading right now that we'll talk about in future videos once I've actually finished it. But I got 20 pages in and was already like, I've got so many ideas for games. Like, this is awesome. Yeah. This is going to be so much fun. And so I think that the answer is always going to be that the game that's on the rails is going to be bad because it's just not going to be fun. The point of these things is that everybody gets to engage and make choices, and the story, believe me, it's much more fun. If you've never played a role-playing game, it is much more fun. The crazy stories that will come out of these games when you have agency and you can do things and affect the world and affect the direction of the story, and you do things that the GM doesn't necessarily expect, and the GM does things you don't expect. That is so much more fun and so much more satisfying than, listening to the DM read his fucking novel to you. There is no situation in which the DM reading his novel to you is fun. Like, that is, or engaging or immersive. If you want to listen to a novel, go listen to an audiobook,
Listen to an audiobook. Exactly. Yeah, and in that same vein, or in keeping with that would you say that take, the limitation sounds counterintuitive, but the limitation of confining yourself, quote unquote, to a somewhat realistic individual as a player character living in a particular world that is subject to certain rules of genre.
Yeah.
That does give you the freedom, because in the real world, no one, we all live, we're all subject to the limitations of our circumstance, right? You don't have, not only do you not have the unlimited opportunity, but it would be madness for, a regular person with a 9-to-5 job to, I don't like this zone anymore. I don't like the way this plot line is going, and so I'm going to book a one-way plane ticket to the Alps just because.
Yeah.
That is
this hex really sucks. I want to go see what's in the next
hex. Really
Yeah.
really sucks. You can't do that.
Yeah.
And even if you had all the money in the world, you still wouldn't do that. You may have more freedom to travel or to do more things, but the things that you do and choose to do are going to be a natural byproduct of what your own motivations and goals and limitations
and
are.
What this comes back to is verisimilitude, which is, the feeling of the game having ringing true in some sense, the feeling of reality. If in reality, the only people generally who are out changing, really moving between different hexes and whatnot are 22-year-old influencers, and the price that they're actually paying is, sucking some rich, disgusting dude's dick.
Right. Yeah. Which there you go.
Yeah. So no, but the kind of the actual point that I'm making, aside from that stupid joke, is the kind of unlimited freedom sandbox thing I find not as appealing, simply because there is a little bit less structure to it that doesn't feel real to me. It's like, oh, I'm just this what do we want to do in today's session? Why don't we go down to the docks and we'll get on a ship and we'll just go somewhere.
Just go somewhere.
Yeah.
You wouldn't do that.
You wouldn't do that. Yeah. And maybe at your table, you're not doing that and there's more structure to it. But some of the stuff that I've seen about the sandbox play, it does sound like this, where I'm like, that doesn't ring true to me at all.
You're playing a video game character at that point.
Right.
That game is trash from a different.
I'm like, do you not have bills? Do you not have some
bills?
Sort of responsibility? Yeah, no.
Yeah, you have, again, you're a blank slate character who has it's the archetypical, shit D&D character or role-playing game character who exists in a complete vacuum of the world around them. And the point you brought up about D&D, that's a good one. That made me think. It is the case that a lot of these, certainly most D&D or D&D-esque settings, tend not to have. They don't have a meaningful structure. It's very video gamey. It's very World of Warcraft-y. And so what ends up happening, what you said happens, GMs can feel overwhelmed. It's like looking at a blank piece of paper or a blank canvas. What do I do here? I need to fill in the blanks, but I may not have the understanding or the vocabulary to articulate the frustration that I'm feeling. But also, what tends to happen is you have like jump the shark type plots, quote unquote, where what do I do? This is kind of, for some reason, an idyllic fantasy high magic world. The only conflicts I do see, the only story hooks that I can sort of gather either from other literature or media in like a fantasy genre or in the world, let's say Forgotten Realms. Well, the only conflicts are sort of these world-shattering or region-shattering threats. And now, if you're going to do that, that genre is a good place to do that. But there's an overabundance of that kind of story, that kind of inciting incident,
and they tend to not be very interesting most of the time.
They tend to not be interesting, because
sometimes they are, and they can be, but they tend to, like we've said previously, like the world's gonna blow up. That's not a very interesting story, Right. It's just not something that rings a little truer here. Is kind of what you're interested in, and the problem. I think this probably is the main problem, is that there's a blank canvas and people don't know how to fill that out. And the kind of OSR way of filling that out would be, okay, you do some prep, and before you even play, you're going to just start with a map, and you're going to fill this out with points of interest and have things, traveling in between those things. You're going to have encounters with randomly generated NPCs, you're going to run into monsters, and the mechanics behind the random encounters are actually kind of interesting, because there are things where it's like, people also tend to, we were talking about this the other day, D&D combat in 5e tends to be to the death, and it's always the death of the monsters, because you don't die, it's not very lethal, but you're also like in 5e D&D, you're a fucking badass. Like, you are a level 1 character is way stronger than a level 0 character. But kind of in the kind of OSR style is that you might meet enemies in, overwhelming numbers. Orcs used to show up in war bands of something like between 30 and 300. And they would have,
I mean, there you go. That's a warband.
but there's systems behind this because it's you've got what is their disposition towards you? That's randomly determined. They may not just be hostile right off the bat, so you may not have to just end up fighting these fuckers and fighting to the death. And then secondly, you're not fighting to the death generally because the monsters have morale, and you can break their morale and they'll retreat, or you can retreat. Whereas the kind of way that it's done in a video game and the way that it's done in 5e is like, oh, we're in combat, it's all to the death. You
got to kill it to get the loot and to get the experience points.
Right. And
the AI is programmed to keep swinging until hit points reach 0.
Yeah. And so there's all of this is there. There's kind of tools that you can use, like these kind of old school tools to fill out a blank canvas. But in my opinion, the best way to fill out the blank canvas is kind of not to start with a blank canvas. Is you find a setting that already has a lot of these details worked out for you, and in a way that is just like giving you ammunition for your mind of like, oh, this could happen. So you don't necessarily have to do all of this work yourself.
Right.
And
you have to go ahead.
No. That was basically where I was going.
Yeah, so it's helpful whether it's your own homebrew setting or it's an established setting. Understand it enough, or understand the region that the game is at least going to be starting well enough to see the contours, see the lines, that are going to give some kind of definition to the game you're putting together, and add to that, have it at least a passing awareness of the genre that you're playing in, because the genre also is going to add depth and perspective and certain limitations in terms of expectation, right?
Right.
A pulp style character with a pulp, playing a player character in a pulp game, there's, to take the example of combat, there's a certain expectation of how combat is going to be portrayed, how it's going to be reacted to, what's going to be involved compared to, something like Alien, or something that is a sword and sorcery type deal, or a Call of Cthulhu type of situation where it's more gritty, grounded, and realistic. It may make perfect sense to have a more cavalier attitude towards violence or danger if you're playing Indiana Jones, right? Or something in that vein, some kind of pulp. But again, whatever sort of milieu you're playing in is going to drive and define and give you, if not explicit story hooks, at least, a kind of undefined inspiration in terms of how and in what direction is this game, is this story, whatever
you want something
going to be driven.
Yeah. And I think so, like, when selecting a setting to play in, because again, I think this is really just one of the biggest pitfalls, is that people start in a sandbox and don't know how to run a sandbox.
Right.
Because I think you can run a sandbox very well, have it be very fun, stories will emerge out of it, all that's great. Mm-hmm. But if you don't know how to do that, and you just start with a setting that doesn't have a strong opinion, you're kind of fucked if you're a new GM. And
you will get burnout very quickly.
You will get very burned out. Yeah. Because
you'll be scrambling all the time.
Right. And you're going to be sitting there wondering
all the time.
And you're going to be wondering, why is it that my game isn't turning out the way that I've seen online? Right. That I think is primarily the reason. And when you're selecting a setting, you want to find one that takes itself seriously on its own terms, even if it's like weird and like kind of goofy.
Right.
Like, it needs to have like an internal logic to it,
Right.
And
even a gonzo setting has its own kind of internal logic, even if that
and
logic
like there
is
are
self-referential.
yeah, it could be the logic could be very weird, but there's got to be boundaries and limitations on it, and you need to know what those are. And I think that's the big problem with people jumping into generic Dungeons and Dragons is that they don't have a world that, first of all, they probably just don't have a world that
Right.
to start with. It's just, this is fantasy. So then you got to come up with something, and that's enough work. That's work on its own. But then you also don't really have a very defined thematic structure to work within. And if you take something like Vampire, which is, and you can run that in Dark Ages too. So, that could be like a fantasy setting. Just as an example, this is an opinionated setting. There is a very clear, consistent way in which the world works. There are very defined already for you factions and relationships. You will have family built into this. Even if your character, your mortal character had no family, they're an orphan, and they grew up in the orphanage of no friends. They kept everyone separate. It doesn't matter.
Right.
When you are turned into a vampire, you have at least one. The person who turned you, you're related to them.
Yep.
There's a character. There's an NPC right there. There's things built into this structure that give you this. And I think, like you said, Cyberpunk is another excellent example. You have like the garbage is just continually being dumped on you, and you have to continue to climb out. And that's just the basis of the game. So that's a much easier starting point for someone who's new to this. And it doesn't, I think that like the idea of there being rails, there doesn't have to be, because this is the other thing. It's like, think of like,
it's a misunderstanding, I think, of what the purpose is.
Well, and I'm kind of thinking of it this way. If you have this blank canvas fantasy world of no flavor and no definition, and you see some, you have an idea of like, oh, the bad guy and the conflict, you can see it off in the distance. You're like, how am I going to get there? Well, let's build a fucking train. Let's get on the train tracks and let's go to it. That you're gonna do that almost naturally if you don't have a set of tools for filling in how you get there anyway. And so I think I have convinced myself in this episode, in this conversation, that it's having no setting and having no experience in these games and going into a generic fantasy setting where there is no boundaries, no story hooks built into you, no world building. That's a big mistake, and that's going to make your game probably get on rails real quick and then suck.
Right.
And so you need to start with a good setting, or you need to know how to build a good setting and build a good sandbox,
Right. I mean, and this also comes back to, if rule -1 is, vet your players. Our rule 0 being intention.
Yes.
You have to, as a player, you need to, it's a ridiculous phrase, but you need to put in the work. It really isn't work. It's
not work. Yeah.
This takes a couple minutes. Like if you really had to, bang something out. Have at least a clear, defined understanding of where your character has been, where he is now, why he's there now, and where does he want to be?
And how does he and how does all of that just fit in the world? Does it make sense with the logic of the world that you're in?
Right. And honestly, I don't know if any player is a good faith actor, let's say, this is self-evident, right? You don't need to, as a player, you don't need to read every single source book on the Forgotten Realms and figure out. That's
Yeah.
another pitfall
Oh,
that
yeah,
people
yeah.
can fall into. It's like,
Yeah.
oh, Kelemvor was not the guy. I hate the Forgotten Realms. I don't know anything about the Forgotten Realms, but like in 1325, it was this god, but then he died and
Yep.
became. Who fucking cares? It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
If you're the GM and that's something you want, then fine, you can do that. Have a clear understanding of who your character is, where they are, and where they want to go. As the GM, have a clear understanding of the genre, the world, whether it's yours or someone else's, and where the game is taking place. Key off of those motivations. If your player character has a firm, is trying to woo this chick in the town or on the space station or in the city or whatever the case, or if you're playing a vampire game and I got turned, right? I became embraced, but I had a wife, or I had a fiance. That's an important character.
And a story's
Have
gonna
an understanding
come
of what
out of
they're
that
doing.
no matter
A
what.
story is going to come out of that.
Yeah.
And have a couple NPCs for your city, your town, space, whatever it is. Factions that make sense. You don't need to write, an encyclopedic definition with a backstory
Right.
of every single faction and every single person. It should come freely, and let the motivations that come to the surface of your awareness be the things that drive you and drive the story. And once that all starts moving, once the session starts, drama will happen organically and naturally.
And here's the thing. I also don't think that if you're a GM who's just starting out and you're like, I do have an idea for a story though. I do have an idea and I think my players will like where where it's going to go. That's totally fine. Start out with that. Draw from your players' backstories. Make sure that, like we said in our other episode, which you haven't watched. If you haven't watched, go watch it because it's good. It's a lot of good advice. If you guys have all made characters that are compatible with the setting and with the kind of seed of the campaign, that the GM has shared with you, that's great. And it's totally fine as a GM to have an idea for a story. And it's totally fine as players to have things that you want to do in the game. But both of you need to understand that you may get some of those moments, you may get to them, but once you all start playing together, things are going to go in different directions. Right. And that's the fun of it. And ultimately that creates a better story. Because I think this is actually where like the biggest point that, and I don't think either of us has been in conflict with this idea. But the big point from a lot of the OSR content that I've been getting is that the story emerges from gameplay. And that is absolutely how I've always run my games. But that doesn't mean that the game has to be totally directionless when you start. And you just have to rely only on these systems and whatnot. The whole point, as the game master, and in my opinion, at least a large part of it, is providing hooks to get the player to say, okay, that's interesting. I want to go in that direction. And then they're going to eventually do something that you're completely, they'll ignore some hook or they'll take it in some way and pull on the line and pull you into the water, like you don't know where it's going to go. And that's awesome because that the story that will emerge out of that is better than anything you would have planned on your own. So I don't think that because I've seen a lot of hostility towards people having an idea for a story for their game, or a plot.
Right.
And that's totally fine to come up with a plot that you would like, if you're like, this is an interesting idea, but just treat it as that. It's a premise. Exactly. A premise upon which everything else is going to come from.
And I don't think I can be convinced otherwise. A premise is great. A story hook is great. I've used I've run games. I've taken premises from whole modules or adventure paths. That's a really cool idea. I didn't think about that. I don't need I don't give a shit about the dungeon maps and the beast.
Yeah, I don't care about that.
I don't care about any of that. I don't care about how you want me to go through this. Okay, there's this very interesting, inciting incident or theme or place or threat or what have you. Awesome. I'm going to take that and I'm going to do it my own way.
Yeah.
Great. Or even NPCs. Like, oh, that's an interesting idea. I wouldn't have thought of that about that. I'll just pluck that.
Yeah.
Sometimes whole cloth.
I mean, yeah, I have stolen NPCs from minor characters from movies, television shows, and just renamed them, reskinned them, because it was like, that's an interesting personality that will fit well into this situation, and you can do that with your random tables, and that's fine, coming up with NPCs. And there's a part of that that's interesting to me because it does add this element of the unexpected, even more unexpected for me, finding what rolls up and how you can how you can bring it into the story. I'm actually very intrigued by that because I haven't done that really. But my whole thing is that it's like I'm like fundamentally when I'm going scene to scene and where the characters do something and it's like, okay, they're going to meet someone here or something is going to happen here. I'm just coming up with that on the fly, my own. I'm not relying on some system to do that. I certainly could, but I think it's just that I've played this style for so long that the improvisational aspect of that is kind of a muscle that I've developed. And I've gotten very good at that.
Yeah.
So I can have the premise and see where that goes. And usually each session will have a premise. And usually the premise, comes from the last thing. I do like the kind of episodic continuing story, not just the monster of the week or, I've never done a hex crawl. I'm interested to do that too. I am very intrigued by all this stuff, but it's like, I've never felt the need to use those things because I've gotten good enough at doing this that it just happens. Yeah.
This is something I agree and have had the same opinion, and I've kind of run things and looked at things in a very similar way. Doing that, participating in that maybe older style of, I don't even know if it's an older style of play. I guess it is, but also relying more or allowing myself to use some of these older style tools. I definitely want to
the old school Renaissance games from 2013.
Right. I want to give it its fair shake though.
Yeah, I do too.
Because again, there may be blind spots I have, or there may be ways of using this, or maybe I'll convince myself that I was right all along.
Right, I know that's
which has been the case so far.
I've done that many times with other topics. Yeah. So I wouldn't be surprised if that happens, but no, but I agree. It's a lot of this stuff we've been talking. It feels like because I haven't been in the OSR. I haven't really been in the hobby for a while.
People.
We're not OSR people. But the more interesting people on the internet for role-playing are the OSR people. It's not the 5e people, or at least the
definitely
current
not. Holy
currently
shit.
not. So a lot of this stuff has been kind of, if it has felt like unearthing, ancient forgotten knowledge, and there was I have been like, do I have some serious blind spots? So to all you OSR creators out there making YouTube videos, please keep doing it. It's very, very interesting.
Please keep doing it.
And we're going to find out if we were right all along, which is probably how we'll feel.
Probably.
Spoiler warning. Or if you guys actually, know something we don't. I think you certainly do know some things we don't. But But I do have to say the hostility though to the narrative style of play, I think is a little overplayed in that it's, if you're considering the narrative style or whatever Critical Role, totally get it. I completely understand that criticism of it, but the I
think the criticism is misplaced. The criticism
Yes.
that's levied primarily against narrative play is more accurately and more appropriately levied at absolute trash players.
Trash
absolute
players,
trash
GMs.
Whether they were playing Black Hack or whether they were playing 5e, it would be utter garbage. These people don't have a defined philosophy. It's certainly not any meaningful loyalty
Right.
to a particular style of play. If anything, their loyalty is to brand and brand alone, and even that is surface level at best.
Yeah.
98%, I think, of 5e players are fair weather consumers.
Yeah.
And they're following bad examples. And
Yes.
that doesn't mean they should be cut any slack, because they shouldn't, because they're terrible.
Right. Garbage in,
but,
garbage out. I mean, it's
Garbage in, garbage out.
these people.
It doesn't
yeah,
matter what.
this is the thing. You could give these people all the training, all the practice, and all the tools, and they'll still be bad.
They'll still be bad. Pearls before swine.
Yeah,
to
exactly.
Be sure. Yeah, but the sense I have from where I'm standing now on primarily things like random encounter tables is, I think it is an interesting supplementary tool, particularly
Yes.
with regards to overland travel in a fantasy setting, or also I could see it being used in a spacefaring setting where you're going from system to system or something like that. But again, that's overland travel in a different sort of, genre, a different milieu. But I am, if you're in a dungeon.
Yeah, totally. That, or if you're generating a dungeon as well.
Right.
Like,
Right.
Again, those aren't the kind of, we don't find those games very interesting. That's not our style of play. But the one thing that I can see, like, instantaneously, I was like, I should have been doing this for years, is random name tables for NPCs. That would have helped me so much. I will be using
I'm actually
those.
really good at coming up with names.
I'm not good at coming up with
fly.
names, and I'm even worse at remembering people's names. So random table
That I'm
and
not
a
good
pencil
at. I need to
will
have
be,
a pen and paper nearby. But that is a hugely beneficial.
There's that, but again, it's like
resource.
when we're talking about like Vampire, which is primarily, that is where the major dominance of my experiences has been Vampire. It really is this kind of dark mafia story.
Mm-hmm.
For me, there's not really a place for random encounters in there, because we've always got goals, and we've always got people with competing goals that are going to get in our way, and I already know who these people are, and I know, so it's, for me, I don't need it there, and I think it wouldn't really work in that
I don't
sort
think
of a
it
setting.
would either, because
In that genre,
Yeah, in that genre and in that setting, definitely. Because you should be, I don't know, you could take this any number of ways. From my perspective, 9 times out of 10, you should be attempting to avoid some kind of combat. And okay, you could say
Yes.
a random encounter is a random encounter regardless of what your intention is, but your quote-unquote encounters are generally either so you're trying to get in somewhere, you're having a social encounter with either a member of the mortal or supernatural society, trying to get in or get out of some place you're not supposed to. The conflicts that are going to happen are generally going to be dictated by the player's actions.
Yep.
You're not just going to get, you're not going to be doing a feeding scene and 1d10 thugs are going to show up, generally speaking, unless you as the GM already know this is someone else's turf, maybe, or you're in the domain of someone else. These are ghouls or dominated, or maybe not even dominated, just a gang or some mortal association that another Cainite has influence over or contacts with, or if you're trying to go into a kindred or a mortal structure that you're not supposed to, and then you're going to have security systems, or you're going into a place that is under werewolf control. Lupines, will, or kinfolk will be. It doesn't quite work. I feel like that's also probably true with kind of a Call of Cthulhu game. And this is sort of the one. I don't have nearly as much experience with Call of Cthulhu as I would like, because I love Lovecraft.
Yeah.
And I've been intrigued for many, many, many years at Call of Cthulhu. I just haven't had the opportunity to dig into it. That is the one game and the one kind of genre that I haven't threaded the needle with respect to our opinion on sort of the freeform Rails debate, because that is in large part an investigative mystery type game. And I don't know how you get around some kind of a mystery plot, or
I don't think you do. I mean, I think
genre.
That's the point. Like that's the genre that it is. Even like New World of Darkness, just standard Blue Book, which now Chronicles of Darkness, the God Machine Chronicle, that is a game of dark mystery. That is the premise of the game. And I think it's probably similar for Cthulhu. And while you can do things against genre and against type, I think for the purpose of a role-playing game, that's kind of you're shooting yourself in the foot if you do that.
Yeah. Again, you have to know the rules before you can break them.
Totally.
It can be done.
Yeah.
And there are games that are specific. Delta Green is like specifically against type, and it does it very well. You actually are fighting back against at least some aspects of the mythos. Right?
But you also, it's like you need to know what the type is to play against it. And
exactly.
Yeah.
You have to know it before you can break it. Yeah, agreed.
Yeah. On that note, I think this is probably a pretty good place to wrap up. We're again about 10 minutes over.
I want to make one point if I can. Something.
Oh, totally. I'm fine with going over. I just
I just want to make this one point, but I think it's a yes. You made it a point a while back about incorporating different story hooks, right? And that by nature, you're not going to get to all of them, right? Of course you're not, because the players can't be in all places.
You have to choose exactly.
However, as the GM, don't feel bad. Don't be precious with your story hooks. Keep in mind, keep those story hooks in your mind, because they are going to evolve without the player's intervention.
Yes.
Again, Vampire or Cyberpunk is great. You seed some some conspiracy about the prince or about the sheriff. The sheriff is learning. Has dealings with the Sabbat. You want to be as obvious as as sort of basic as possible. Fair enough. The players don't pick up on it, or they don't care, or they get sidetracked. That plot line is going to, the ramifications of that are going to continue to play themselves out.
Yeah.
And it's going to come back. It's going to reemerge to the surface again in a very different way. And that's going to, it's the pot keeps boiling, right?
Exactly. And I think that's
all these things are shaping and moving.
And I think that's also, I think actually Basic Expert he might have talked about this in that video that we brought up earlier, or it might just be that, I'm a boomer with dementia and it's all, boiling together. But yeah, that I think is a kind of one of the kind of better ideas and things that have has been emphasized by the content I've been seeing recently is the idea that the GM and DM should be kind of trying to simulate the world to an extent. I don't like necessarily like mechanically simulating everything and I have to roll for everything. That doesn't appeal to me.
It's impossible to do so.
But the idea absolutely should be, always should be, that the world, there's stuff happening in the world unconnected to the players. That stuff is still happening while the players are doing their stuff. And so you want this living world. You want the consequences of them not picking up on your story hooks to not necessarily come back to haunt them, but to impact the game in some way. Exactly like what you're saying, like the pot keeps boiling. And that is, again, you can't really do that if you don't have a grasp on a good setting. If you don't have, really a kind of a fleshed out idea of who else is in this world and who else is populating it and what kind of factions there are and what kind of characters NPCs are surrounding your PCs, you're not going to be able to do that, So
you're not going to be able to do that.
Just jumping into generic fantasy world is not a very strong point for a game, for the start of a game.
Right.
Yeah. So, and that's where I think
Agreed.
if you're inexperienced and you don't have tools to fill out a blank canvas, you don't have the paint at your disposal, you're going to have a bad time. So pick a good setting or
Agreed.
Go full Gygax and simulate the whole world with random tables for, all time.
Ugh. I mean,
yeah. Obviously don't do that.
Report back your findings to us.
Yeah. Obviously
Your
don't do
mileage
that.
may
Do it our
vary.
way.
Yeah, definitely. On that note.
Yeah. On that note, I think we can wrap up. So yeah, it's been great. I think there's probably
as always,
more to be said on this.
There definitely is.
Yeah.
We could you keep talking about this in any number of different ways. We could talk specifically about a D&D high fantasy type setting. We could talk about Call of Cthulhu type setting or a modern day investigative.
Yeah.
There's any number of ways. And no doubt, again, this, like we said at the beginning, this is a perennial issue.
Right. And
that continues to come up. And it's a hard thing to, to wrap your head around, I guess, to a certain extent, if you're coming at this new.
Yeah. And I would say if you're not coming at this new and you've made it this far into the episode, please let us know what you think. And if you think we're wrong, we definitely want to hear from you so we can argue with you in the comments. And possibly talk about this on our live stream sometime. But yeah, give us a like, subscribe to the channel, and if you found value in this video, please share it with your friends. Put it on Twitter, put it on Facebook if you're 1,000 years old. Anywhere that you want to post this, please do.
We want to engage with.
We want to engage, and we're having a lot of fun with you guys. So show up to the live stream. I'm really enjoying the live streams a lot. It's a lot of fun to engage with you guys.
Thursday nights, 9 Eastern.
Yeah, Thursday nights, 9 Eastern, right here.
Exactly.
All right. And on that note, I think we can wrap it up. So remember,
until the next one. Yeah.
Until the next one. No compromises.
No apologies. No apologies.
All right, we fucked it up.
You got it right. We fucked it up.
Yeah, we fucked it. What is it? I don't even remember it now. No apologies.
No compromises.
There we go.